now we're going to talk about how John Marshall, probably the most famous or one of the most powerful Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is actually going to, in some ways, support James Madison's um, explanation of the legislative branch being the most powerful branch of government, and his argument under Federalist 51 that the legislative branch is a little bit more powerful, not completely more powerful than other branches, but we're going to talk about what happened that really changed the game. So you guys know there's been a big battle between what we call state writers, or people that believe that states' rights, and Amendment 10, that if it's not in the Constitution, it goes right back to the states, is one of the most important articles of peace of the Constitution of all. However, on the other side of it, you have the more of the Federalists, or the more people that believe in central government, and they say, no, no, no. In fact, the states' rights have to be superseded over by the federal government, especially when it comes to big issues that affect everybody in the country. So this battle has been going on since the creation of the Constitution, and actually before the Constitution. Because if you remember, we had the Federalists who wanted a central government, and they had to centralize the power more with the federal government. Then you had the anti-Federalists who believed that states in themselves tended to need more power and would know what's best over their people, and that's where a lot of the sovereignty should come from. And the power from the people should come more through the states than the federal government. Well, now we have John Marshall, a Supreme Court justice, who's really trying to change the consciousness of Americans and starting to help us see ourselves as American, not as states people first. He's from Virginia, and he's thinking to himself, at first he was a Virginian, but then he fought in the Revolutionary War and realized that, hey, we have to start seeing ourselves as American. So he's going to support interpretations of the Constitution that tend to be more in favor of a stronger central government. So let's talk about probably one of the biggest interpretations and one of the most important cases of all. McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. Now, McCulloch versus Maryland itself as a case is relatively we think it's kind of a low-level argument, but what happens is it really changes the game. The Constitution has been now formalized since the 1780s, and now we're talking about there's no true clear power from the legislative branch outside of what is explicitly enumerated. Remember those terms, explicit, which is you could actually point to it in Article 1 of the Constitution, or enumerated, where it's actually written, Article 1, Clause, 5 under Article 8, So, necessary and proper clause, for example. So, what he establishes in this case changes history, and we're seeing pushback on that right now. He establishes what's called the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause is this idea that the U.S. Constitution and the federal laws are over state laws. Anything necessary and proper or implied from Congress to have or do not have does not have to be enumerated. So you do have implied powers according to McCulloch versus Maryland. And essentially what happens in McCulloch versus Maryland in the case itself is that the U.S. government in 1816, this is still an argument. You probably see a lot of conspiracy theories if you read on the internet about this, that the federal bank was established to try to make sure that there was a common currency and that we could use, and that the federal government itself could delegate money out quickly or resolve, maybe deal with some economic unclarity. And what Maryland did is they basically put a $15,000 fee if anybody went to bank from outside Maryland in Maryland, so that all the banks would be state companies in Maryland. So when the federal government had federal banks and they were the only really outside bank in Maryland, they would have to pay a $15,000 fee just to have a federal bank in the state of Maryland. Well, what happens essentially is Marshall rules that is actually against the Constitution, and that in fact the U.S. legislative branch can create a bank, and the banks themselves can be located in a place in the United States, and they do not have to pay state fines or taxes or follow state laws, because the federal government's laws supersede, and the legislative laws supersede the state laws. And they won. Now, more importantly, what this does is establish that the federal constitution, the federal law, generally takes precedent over states and even state constitutions, and that's really important. It prohibits states from interfering with federal government exercise of its constitutional powers and from assuming any functions that are exclusively entrusted to the federal government. So, under a necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, we'll get more into that, states have to follow what Congress feels is necessary and proper. It does not have to be written down or enumerated under Article 1, Clause 8 of the Constitution. Very, very important concept. It does not, however, allow government to review or veto state laws before the law takes effect. So, in order for a law to be superseded, it has to, in fact, be issued by the state, and then we can go to court. The federal government can take them to court and challenge it and say it's against the Constitution or against the Supremacy Clause. But again, just talking about a law itself or preparing to vote on a law does not necessarily make it unconstitutional. They can play with that and think about it. Okay, so we see real quick, the law of the land is the U.S. Constitution. If you think about it, when President and members of Congress, they swear their allegiance to the United States Constitution, to uphold the Constitution. Our military is meant to uphold the Constitution above all and protect the Constitution and the outline of how our country is supposed to work. Then, under that is the acts of Congress, so the legislative branch under the Supremacy Clause. As long as they make laws that are not against the Constitution and they're necessary and proper, that's allowed, as long as they don't conflict. Then, one step down from that is the state constitutions. State constitutions are the law of their states, and they're above everything in the state. That state, for example, we live in Missouri, but if there's a federal law that supersedes or is superior to the state constitution, then state constitution has to step down. Or if it goes against the U.S. Constitution, obviously, then state constitutions have to step down. Now, state statutes is just a fancy way of saying state laws. And the reason we have statutes is there's just so many of them. There's just so many statutes, and you actually need to know the numbers to find the law in legal books so that you could even see exactly what the wording is. But state laws do not supersede or go above the state constitution. So what's in our constitution is over that. And then finally, you have city and county laws. So St. Louis City and St. Louis County, again, they are not as powerful, and states' laws supersede, and our Constitution supersedes the city and county. One example has been recently is the city of St. Louis, just relatively recently, had passed a $10 an hour minimum wage. And minimum wage is set at $7, I think 35 cents an hour federally. Okay, so that would be the U.S. Constitution. So there's no way that the state constitution or the state laws could compete with that, because it was an act of Congress, and that power is seen as supremacy as applied under Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. Now, the state and our U.S. Constitution had set the minimum wage that I can't remember. It was like $8 and something, 50 cents. Okay, so what happened is the state, which had tended to have much more conservative leadership on the Republican Party, challenged the fact that St. Louis City was a very progressive, much more liberal government that wanted $10 an hour for everybody that works in the city. They challenged it and said that was against the state constitution, and they made a law, and their laws superseded the $10 an hour. Now, they could fight that out in court, but essentially what happened is the city of St. Louis had to go back to the state minimum wage and could not raise a larger or could not require a higher payment of city businesses than the rest of the state. And that was really interesting to see it in action. But then actually what happened in the end is the citizens of the state of Missouri, under the state constitution, they amended the state constitution so that actually our minimum wage is going to progressively, after I think it's 3 years, it's going to go up to $12 an hour. So it shows you the state legislators that might not care for that a $12 minimum wage, they have to abide by the state constitution, and they're currently trying to fight that as we're learning. All right, so let's move on. So what do you think of the 7 main principles of the Constitution? We talked about the Supremacy Clause. That's really interesting, but and what principle that would we have to even think what principle does that really fall under? But we're gonna just give you a second. I want you to kind of write a list or do a mental list of the most main constitutional principles in your mind that we've talked about all year, or we're learning about and reviewing right now. Okay, I want you to make that list. And then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, go back over, make sure you're clear on the terms. Popular sovereignty was one of the principles. It's the power that the rule of the nation comes from the power of the people. The people are the government, and the power comes from them. For the people, Abraham Lincoln's famous, for the people, by the people, of the people. Meaning the government is leadership that is directed, fired, and hired by the people. Republicanism, one to many, meaning we're elected one person to represent us. We do not have direct democracy in America, if you remember at the beginning of the year. But we do have republicanism, not the Republican Party, but Republicans as like like voting for a representative to represent a body of people. One to many. Federalism, a division of power between the nation state and local government. The Supremacy Clause we just talked about says the nation law is above all. So it goes Constitution, and then congressional laws are above all. However, if states can argue if something goes against the Constitution, then maybe even federal laws could be overpowered by the Constitution and the Supreme Court. Separation of powers. Divide the powers of legislative, executive, and judicial branch. Keep the powers separate, pretty much independent of themselves. Again, that's more of Rousseau, but also James Madison really focused on this in Federalist 51. Checks and balances, very American idea that all branches of government could check each other, and this kept the branches' powers relatively balanced. We also see sub-checks in a federalist system, but not really a balance. The federal government is definitely superior to the states, but the checks are there. Limited government, no one person can or group can use the nation or or go above the law. Okay, that's very important. So in an unlimited government like Kim Jong-un in North Korea is unlimited. He could do whatever he wants. It's a dictatorship. If he wants to kill his uncle on television, which he did, he can't. There's nobody to stop him. There's no clear limit. But what limits us in the United States is our Constitution. The Constitution says the president can only do this or that, and the Supreme Court will step in to interpret it and limit them. The problem with, for example, an executive branch is they're the ones that execute the laws. So if they don't execute the laws correctly, even if the Supreme Court says what they're doing is unconstitutional, and the legislative branch says that it's against the law, it's a big challenge. And we've seen historically, Andrew Jackson has kind of disregarded the Supreme Court, and it's caused some issues with executive powers. Individual rights. People have liberties that are protected from the government. And I think we can remember that our individual rights that are clearly listed or actually enumerated in the Constitution are in the Bill of Rights. That's our civil, we're going back to our civil liberties. However, we have under one of the amendments, Amendment 9, actually, we have many more individual rights than just the ones listed in the Bill of Rights. Okay, so you have the right to marriage, right to travel, many other freedoms you have, and we have to think about that aspect as well. How does that apply to safety? So we've been dealing with the idea of a quarantine. Our individual rights, do they supersede the rights of the whole? Well, in a quarantine, I think your biggest argument would be under a federalist system. If the federal government says we need to quarantine, or federal bureaucracies say we need to do something, then state law should follow should follow congressional law. So if Congress would actually make laws that say we need to follow quarantine or this, that would supersede it. Right now, we're kind of letting the states, or we're seeing the states have kind of been let to do their own thing. And there could be positive and negatives under that. All right. So let's break down. We're going to go kind of quick through some of this material. It's just kind of direct information. Legislative branch establishes Article 1 of the United States Constitution, 1788. That's the actual White House. You can see on the left, you have the Senate, and then you have the House of Representatives. They're both the wings of the Capitol Hill. The legislative branch is supposed to be the most powerful branch of government, according to Madison. I think most historians and political scientists would agree that initially it was supposed to be the most powerful. However, historically, I think a lot of historians would say that power has changed, that the legislative branch has lost a lot of power. But definitely under the Supremacy Clause, they gained quite a bit of power, and some of that power has been pushed back on, as we've talked about throughout the year. We'll talk about more with legal cases. The legislative branch also writes bills, and then we'll get more specific on that. Let's keep going. Now, this is very important. So, if somebody says to you, what is under Article 1, Section 8? You would say, oh, the enumerated powers of Article 1, Section 8. So, Article 1, Section 8 is the enumerated, the written listed powers of Congress. Okay? So it actually says, you go to Article 1, which is where Congress is located in the Constitution, go to Section 8, it actually lists the powers of Congress. So we're going to break this down, and some of these are pretty direct. Congress shall have the power to regulate interstate commerce. We'll talk about the Commerce Clause. So if it's between states, they can regulate. If it's internally, interstate commerce, so it's between like St. Louis and Kansas City, for example, unless it affects some kind of federal and national interest, that is going to be under state law. Declare war. Wow, a lot of people get this wrong. We know adults. We do survey after survey, and I don't know where the misconnect is coming from, but it does kind of make sense. A lot of adults we survey, they would say, who has the power to declare war? They say the president. Well, I could see why you get confused, because if you think the Vietnam War was a war, or Korean War was a war, or Iraq, the Persian Gulf War, or Afghanistan, you think these are all wars. Believe it or not, technically, we have not declared war since World War II. And that's because Congress, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and even then, Roosevelt did not declare war. He went to Congress, and he made his famous speech in the infamy of the history of the United States. This day will never be forgotten, And the response of Congress was overwhelming the cheer, and let's go to war with the Japanese. World War II began for the United States, and then the response was, of course, the Germans, declared war on us because they were allies with the Japanese. That's the last time we've declared war. Iraq was actually more of an executive action, and the powers were given to them through Vietnam. Had caused a lot of conflict because under the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, Congress had given quite a bit of their power over to the president. And there's a lot of discussion on this, but probably one reason Congress would actually do that is if the war goes bad like Vietnam did, who gets the blame? Who takes the responsibility? That's the president. Because Congress doesn't necessarily want that responsibility. But the other side of it is there's no real check on this. If the Congress just keeps giving the president the power to go to war, at what point has it gotten, or will it be such a mess that you have presidents making decisions on war, and that was not intended by the Articles of Article 1, Section 8. Levy taxes, which is raise taxes. You can see that in the federal level. We raise taxes federally, and the money is spent. I don't even know. We're probably. I think the last time I looked, we're at over $20 trillion of debt. We just spent another $2.2 trillion on, stimulus packages. We just constantly are going into debt. However, according to the Constitution, they have the power to do that, to increase spending and to keep borrowing money. The truth is they're borrowing money from future generations. So whatever's not paid back now is going to have to pay. You're going to have to pay back if you, as students, when you come into the tax world. And that's why a lot of these decisions have to be made. Do we cut back on services by the federal government, or do we pay more taxes? how is this going to work? Because there are consequences for running up essentially credit all the time and paying more and more interest on something as opposed to just paying directly for something without interest. That's a big discussion to have. So borrowing money, levying taxes, raising your taxes, and then borrowing the money we just talked about. So levying taxes is raising your taxes. Are you willing to let your taxes to go up so that we could borrow money now? How many of you guys are excited about the idea of the U.S. government spending a lot more money now, and then later on, you're going to have to pay more taxes when you get out of college? Or you have a career as a doctor or a lawyer, or are you a manager or a business employee? Are you okay with paying more and more taxes to offset all this debt that we borrowed? But then on the other side of the discussion, is there times where you actually need to raise the amount of money we borrow and spend it? So if you buy into the Democrats and Keynesian economics, Keynes would argue that if the economy is tanking or it's going bad, that's when the government needs to step in and borrow money and spend money. You actually have to spend and borrow money to keep the economy stable and not from getting worse. And then when things are good, then maybe we should pay more taxes or start cutting back on the amount of money we borrowed, paying down our credit cards. Okay, so legislative branch, Article 1, Section 8. Legislative branch makes the laws. Under the elastic clause, the legislative branch can be expanded its powers if it's necessary and proper, and we've talked about that. Some things that are necessary and proper today would be everything from like technology. A big discussion we're having right now is what do you do with social media? It's a very complicated question, and I think you're going to have to come with your own argument on this one. But do you think that the federal government, under a necessary proper clause, could regulate Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, all the social media groups? Can we regulate them under the necessary proper clause? Or is the Constitution supersede that under the First Amendment? It says freedom of speech. So some counter arguments might be, well, if we don't regulate social media, can't they misinform or actually jeopardize people's safety? So, for example, in the situation of a pandemic, if there's misinformation going out about the virus and people are breaking laws, are completely confused on what the truth is about something, should the federal government step in and the FCC and push on Facebook to not publish misinformation that could jeopardize other people's safety? Because it sounds like just a First Amendment issue, but on the other side of it, it's actually a physical safety issue. If somebody really believes that this virus, you could get rid of this virus by eating some kind of poisonous medicine, and they hurt themselves, or if they think that the best way to get rid of the virus is to just go out and interact with people, and they get this misinformation or they hear these conspiracy theories that are not really based on evidence, does the federal government, are they able to step in and say, no, Facebook, you got to stop this? Or how should we handle this? So that's a good question, something to talk about. But on the other side of it, freedom of speech, what does it apply to? Well, the Supreme Court has argued for years that the biggest arguments have been, as long as it's political or religious, it is covered. Well, necessary and proper clause would say, counter might be, what if it's a religious action that jeopardizes the safeties of others or yourself? Something's illegal. So we've talked about everything from Oregon and Smith, Wisconsin and Yoder. You talk about religious practices that are unconstitutional or go against federal law are not necessarily covered. So like doing drugs, for example, in Oregon, because it's a part of your indigenous American culture, is still not covered under the Constitution because it goes against federal law. Or polygamy and marrying several wives or husbands because it's part of your religion in America is not covered under the Constitution, has been the argument. So this gets very, very complicated very, very quickly. Probably one of the biggest examples, just a simple example of necessary and proper, would be the creation of a national speed limit. The idea that there's got to be a maximum speed limit because there's parts of the United States Wyoming, where there's hardly anybody there. Is there still such a thing as logical speed that you could go to where you are just jeopardizing everybody, including yourself? And who incurs the costs? If you're doing behavior that that infringes on other people's liberties. So if you're going 150 miles an hour and there is no way that you could stop without killing yourself or killing other people, can Congress regulate that? And the answer was, in this case, yes. Under necessary proper cause, they can. Okay, we're not going to do the mentee. So let's look at this one. Identify the best definition of necessary proper. Is it A, the power of Congress to make laws to carry out its delegated powers? Okay. B, the power of Congress to create laws that apply only to the federal government? C, the power to override the actions of the president? Or D, the power of the Supreme Court to overturn laws? I'll give you a second to think about it. Okay, this answer was A, the power of Congress to make laws to carry out its delegated powers. Okay, so if it needs to make a law to actually delegate its responsibilities, they could do that. They could make a law like we talked about McCulloch versus Maryland, where they could create a national bank, and the bank itself could go out there